Okay, so when I was thinking about this talk and what I was going to say about this vast subject of bodhicitta, I've been thinking about it anyway pre the talk. My mind kept going to a particular teaching that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And what my mind kept going to was that teaching on the three aspects of faith. You know, that one, very traditional and then sort of worked up by Subhuti, where you've got deep faith in realities, lucid faith in values, and longing faith in capacities. So imagine that's familiar territory for all of you. And I was wondering why is, here I am, I'm meant to be talking about the bodhicitta, but my mind keeps going to this teaching. And I think it's because with those three aspects, you've got quite a well-articulated and worked out scheme, if you like, of how we have to have all aspects of our being in operation for the Dharma life. So when we talk about deep faith in realities, we're talking about the whole sort of, our cognitive dimension. When we talk about lucid faith and values, we're talking about, for want of a better word, our emotional dimension. When we talk about longing, faith and capacities, we're talking about the volitional. So we've got all three there, as the Tibetans say, our head, heart and legs. Yeah, so we've got all those three there. And it's all those three together that will flower in enlightenment. So as I say, I think that's why my mind kept going to that. I wanted a talk that would include all these three aspects of our being. So what the teaching, when we talk about in terms of faith, shows us that, yes, we've got to have all these three aspects in relationship with each other. Also, I love that teaching because it shows us that from our very first sort of glimmerings all the way to enlightenment, it's the same trajectory. So from our very first moment of walking into a Buddhist center, if you remember that, from that very first moment when we just, our heart responds to something in the atmosphere. We can't even put it into words. Our mind responds. Maybe the first time we hear teaching on dukkha or impermanence, something says yes, that's what I thought all along. From our very first experiments in trying to put things we've learned into practice, right from those very first days, all the way to the fullness of enlightenment, it's the same thing. It's not that we've got to add anything new in. We've just got to let all those things flower. It won't happen automatically, obviously, but we've got to deepen, draw out, educate all those, and then you get this lovely trajectory. So the thing about that trajectory is it gives us a way of practicing. So not only have you got a description of Shraddha and then a description of enlightenment as containing all these aspects of our being, but you've actually, we're given a way of practicing that includes all these dimensions. And this is what I want to explore in the first main section of my talk. It's three main ways of practicing. So what do we mean by practicing anyway? So I'm going to just give you one way of thinking about it. So you could think about what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do to move from myself to the Buddha, as we're trying to link the unconditioned with the conditioned. That's one way of thinking about what we're trying to do. I'm aware that I'm immediately using a spatial metaphor here. I'm following Subhuti in this, in a sense of bringing back these terms, conditioned and unconditioned. Obviously, I would just caveat that with, obviously, we know there's not a real place called the conditioned, a real place called the unconditioned. At the same time, that is her imagination. Our imagination works often in terms of place. So just remember space and time are only concepts, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, just remember that. And just sort of see it as how our imaginations work. So our imaginations work often in a spatial way. So you can, in that way, you can think of what we're trying to do in our Dharma lives is linking the unconditioned with the conditioned, and using this sort of spatial metaphor, it allows us then to think of the bodhicitta as something that descends, if you like, the bodhicitta itself being that linking of the unconditioned with the conditioned. You're trying to manifest something from beyond the world in the world. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. And the bodhicitta is that manifestation. So there's our task, and what I'm suggesting, this of course isn't original to me at all, is that we can have a three-pronged approach to that task, using all these aspects of our own beings. So if we think about the cognitive aspect of our own being, well, what we have to do is we have to reflect. We have to, in order to link the unconditioned with the conditioned, we have to inquire into the conditioned deeply enough that we go through the door, as it were, into the unconditioned. So, of course, what I'm referring to here is the whole teaching of the lakshanas and the doorways to liberation, to freedom. So you're inquiring into the lakshanas deeply enough and going through the door, as it were, to the unconditioned. It'll take you there if you reflect deeply enough. If we think of what we do volitionally, then we act skillfully. We sort of use the fact of condition. We use the fact that we experience ourselves as a me and a world out there. We use that skillfully and make the conditioned more and more susceptible to the unconditioned. It's like we're sort of thinning the conditioned by our ethical practice so that it's more and more susceptible to the unconditioned, to the descent of the bodhicitta, if one wants to think like that. And then the third way, which is more the emotional aspect of our beings. Emotional isn't like really the best word, but anyway, I'll use it just now for want of a better. Well, I think the better is actually to use the language of cultivating responsiveness. So we work on cultivating responsiveness to value, and we see that just as we're moving towards the unconditioned, it's moving towards us, or it's moving us towards it. Yeah. So that's the three ways, and outline. I'm going to go into each in a little bit more depth, and then I'm going to sort of try and talk about how they all relate to each other. So, okay, so going back to this, the cognitive aspect again, the head aspect, if you like, by tradition. So this is primarily reflecting on the lakshanas. Maybe good to remind us at this time that Bhante has argued that there are in fact 4 lakshanas that he would count. He would count the reflection on shubha, ashubha, moving to shubha also as a lakshana. Just a reminder, but that's kind of, in a sense, by the by for this talk. But we're reflecting on the lakshanas. So there's been a real upsurge in this, in our order and whole movement, particularly in the order recently, which this reflection on the lakshanas, particularly anatta, which is great actually to have that, such a lively discourse in our order. Reflection on, particularly anatta. Many people have found insight inquiry methods very useful in this reflection on anatta. Myself, I've been my own way of trying to deepen this practice. I'm very, very lucky being on both this year the 3-month Akashavana retreat and followed directly by a 2-month solitary retreat, where I really try to deepen my exploration of the 6 element practice. It's a practice I do on solitaries always, But it was great having 5 whole months to explore the 6 element practice. And I found a sort of new way of doing it, directed by Subhuti. I've not done any of the order insight material, but I wonder if you can tell me later whether there's any similarity in the way that I found of doing, which was, well, treating the 6 element practice as an inquiry. So, those of you that are familiar with the practice to some extent, there's these traditional phrases given by the Buddha: it's not me, it's not mine, it's not myself, with regard to the 6 element. I find myself, when I use those phrases, I don't know, they can just get a bit hypnotic. I haven't always found them easy to relate to just by saying them. Turn them into a question, and you've got something a bit more interesting, I think. So to actually ask yourself, is the earth element the same or different than me? And sort of really interrogate that, and then interrogate yourself further. How do I know? If I think it's the same, how do I know? How do I really know? And I really enjoy this idea of trying to test these notions to their own destruction, and then finding the freedom. Yeah, test the notions to destruction, finding the freedom. So I found that inquiry sort of method of the 6 element practice very fruitful for myself. If anyone's interested, I can talk to you more later. Also, the other way that I have appreciated, and I could do it much more, I'm sure, bringing in this anatta reflection, is, well, something Subhuti has recently called reaction practice. This practice, it goes way back to a Windhorse seminar given on Boxing Day 1993 to the team at Windhorse, where the team were saying to Bhante, well, look, here we are working all the time, selling gifts, shouldn't we be up a mountain meditating? And he gave them a way to practice, an insight practice to be used in everyday life. And it was reflecting in an insight way on all the reactions that come up on everyday life. Bhante said, for example, say you get angry or disappointed or so on with how work's going or your relationships between people. You can deal with that in a samatha way, and maybe that's necessary at first. You've got to calm down so you don't do anything you regret. You can do that. But actually, much deeper, you can use that as an insight practice. You can reflect on, you can really see what is it I'm trying to defend in this reaction, and realise that in the end, what you're defending is simply a pattern of defensiveness. And then you're like, again, that takes you through that door, yeah? So these are, and I'm sure there's other, we can find, I think it's important to find our own way to reflect deeply on the lakshanas, particularly anatta. We have to practice volitionally, we have to practice ethics. I would say be careful about giving this up prematurely. And also, I think we have to understand what we're doing when we practice ethics more deeply. I can say that with some confidence because that we have to understand it more deeply, because I did a little tour when Not About Being Good came out. I did a little tour of centres launching the book. So I went to many centres, mostly in the UK, 1 or 2 outside the UK. And I simply asked people, well, why do we practice ethics? And people did have some answers to that question. Many people were able to answer the question, and this was including order members and mitras. Many people were able to answer the question in terms of how it affected ourselves. So people talked about the importance of having a clear conscience in order to meditate and just to live and so on. So many people were aware of that. Some people, not quite so many, but some people, could stretch themselves enough to see that we practice ethics because of, surprise, surprise, other people, So some people did manage to see it. very few people, and only with quite a lot of prompting from me, could see that we are actually practicing ethics for the sake of enlightenment. That was not well understood. That actually there is, if you like, that third level of ethics. We're practicing ethics, for ourselves. That's the kind of territory of the Dhammapada, the first verses, isn't it? That we ourselves will be happier and freer if we practice ethics, if we practice skillfully. So you can say that's the first level. We're practicing ethics because we start to understand that we are not separate from other people. Our empathy extends to other people. I always think those levels are, they're sequential, but level 1, level 2 are quite close. But then I think there's another whole level, which is we're trying to overcome selfishness altogether. Yeah, we're trying to overcome selfishness altogether. That's what an enlightened being, that's what the life of an enlightened being, that's how it would be lived. They wouldn't, an enlightened being, the Buddha, of course, wouldn't be trying to practice ethics. Unselfishness would just be second nature. And that level, I think, is very much higher. So I think we need to understand that more deeply, why we're practicing ethics. I think, this volitional aspect, I think another reason not to give it up prematurely, or maybe that isn't quite the right way of putting it, not to belittle it or something, is very, very... very, very useful, because it always gives us something to do, doesn't it? If we just don't know what to do, if we're a bit lost, we can just, classically just be generous. And I really, the reading Punyamala read yesterday from Living with Kindness is one of my favourites of Bhante, where he says, if you're struggling to understand the mysteries of shunyata, etc., just simply be a little less selfish. Just be more unselfish, yeah? And he says the understanding comes after the experience, not before, yeah? So it gives us something to do. So you could, thinking like this, you could say the conditioned and the unconditioned are related through the next skillful thing you do. Yeah? So then... moving on, so then this kind of emotional responsiveness aspect of our being. So Buddha again's got loads to say on this. He gave a very important, I think, lecture on this at Padmaloka in a series about the system of practice. And what he really stressed there is this starts with ordinary responsiveness to value, yeah, and it's our responsiveness to value. It's not somebody else's. This is like really, really important. He said if we don't start with our own responsiveness to value, beauty, truth, there's a whole spectrum of what's valuable. If we don't start with our own, we'll end up... our whole Dharma life will be like an edifice. Yeah, it'll be over here. There'll be ourselves with all our own feelings and responses here, and our Dharma life there. So very, very important to find out what we respond to. Actually, if she doesn't mind, I might just mention something Sadaya Sihi, where's Sadaya Sihi? And there she is, said in relation to it. Just gives us quite a good example, because Sadaya Sihi was saying on the way to her ordination retreat, she was in some cultural place, where was it, Siena or somewhere. Anyway, it's one of these places where there's loads of art. And the person she was with was kind of looking at all the art and having all these wonderful experiences, and she was feeling, and I'm sure we relate to this, sorry for singling her out, I've had the, God, I should be responding to this art, but I'm like, just don't really like it, or don't really. But actually then she saw some people carrying out a peaceful protest outside of a bank, I think. I don't know what they were protesting about, but she said, that was when her heart was moved, just at the act of people almost... their sort of bravery and the futility of it. That was what moved her heart. So then I was really encouraging her, as I encouraged myself. If you need to find out what we respond to, there's the response. Don't think it should be over here. So we have to start with that ordinary responsiveness. You could give a whole talk on this. When that oh yes, we've got to cultivate it, because it so easily just gets deadened in us, so we've got to cultivate it. And if it's alive in us, then when it meets the three jewels, then it becomes Shraddha proper, yeah? So we vitalize it, and then it becomes Shraddha proper. And then, it just deepens, strengthens, whatever metaphor you want to use, so that actually when we become a Buddha, so you could say that a Buddha, an enlightened being, is a being who can't but respond to value and sees value wherever it is. But the most exciting thing of all, I think, is that this is two ways. So just as it's almost like one's responding to value, but somehow it's like something beyond us comes alive from its own side. It's hard to put it into words, but I'm sure you've all experienced it. It's like something comes alive from its own side. I think one experience is this, an aesthetic experience, especially if you're trying to create something, anything. It could be a work of art, but it could be something very, very simple, like building a shrine or making something, that you're doing something, and all of a sudden it speaks to you. It speaks back to you and says, "Oh, I'm ready now." And your work is to listen to that. So that is sort of mysterious, but it's true, isn't it? I think we all have had that. It's like something, you just put that last flower on the shrine, and suddenly the shrine comes alive from its side, as it were. Or you just find the right word for your poem, or even, I was thinking even in ordinary experiences, like, I don't know, putting an outfit together, or getting dressed in the morning, you suddenly put your hat on, you think, all kind of comes together, That's pay attention to those moments. That's important. That's important, actually. If we don't have that, we can't have our religious life, I don't think. So we respond to value. We're allowing something to come alive from its own side and experiencing that. And of course, as Buddhists, the most important thing is to see it's represented in the Buddha. That's the something beyond is ultimately represented in the Buddha. And we can only see that something beyond with the eye of imagination. This is what we have to develop. I wanted to just give one more example about this. I don't know if people have been to the British Museum. People in the UK might have been to the British Museum. Anyway, they've got some wonderful things, and they released some little DVDs about their best works of art. And one of them is this standing Tara. So they've got an immense standing Tara there, and that's one of their treasures of the British Museum. And they made this DVD about this the Tara, and they had all different people talking, the curators of the museum and so on. And they had the Buddhist scholar, Professor Gombrich, talking about Tara, and he's very knowledgeable, very kind of could talk about the Tara and the lineage and how, she fitted in with the whole Buddhist pantheon of deities and everything. So you could talk all about that. You couldn't fault him, I'm sure, on everything he knew about this Tara. And then you had the artist, Anthony Gormley. And Anthony Gormley was just on the film looking at the statue, and he said, when you see an object like that that's been worshipped through centuries, you see the aura around the figure. Yeah. So I thought that was a very, very interesting contrast. You've got the professor who can tell you all the details faultlessly, and then you've got the person looking with the eye of imagination who can see the aura. And I would argue that seeing of the aura is the more real. That's the more real than the world of sense, yeah, of our senses. And that's what we're trying to do in our relation with the Buddha. We're trying to see the aura, as it were. We're trying to feel the Buddha as a presence in our life. And that has to affect us So it's not just that we're aware of the presence of the Buddha, that's very, very important, but that presence has to sort of descend into us, as it were. That has to affect us. I've recently been thinking that's the difference between a devotee and a disciple. The devotee will see the Buddha and even worship the Buddha. The disciple will be affected by the Buddha and transformed by the Buddha. Again, possibly another whole talk there, but anyway, moving on. I want to say now about how these three aspects interrelate and kind of, if this is the right way of putting it, can be correctives for each other. That's not quite the right way of putting it, but you'll see what I mean. So, back again to the first one, this kind of cognitive dimension. So without that, without insight, without our consciousness being purified of identity, ethics just degenerates into just me doing good. Yeah. So without insight, ethics just is reduced to just me doing good to you. You know. So and that's not what it's about. We know. And without consciousness being purified of identity, we could visualize the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas all we like, but actually they'll just be devas. They won't be the Buddha. They'll just be devas. We need the dimension of shunyata for the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to be Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So that's what happens if we neglect that aspect. On the other hand, if we overprivilege that aspect at the expense of the other two, this is all material for your discussion groups, by the way, I would argue that if we overprivilege that, then what we call the real spiritual life becomes something private, becomes something inner, that we might tend to dismiss things like the institutions of the movement as not having depth, that the real depth's to be found in meditation, perhaps in inner exploration. I think it's very interesting the metaphors we use, actually. I've been noticing that more in the parlance is the metaphor of waking up. I was more used to myself the metaphor of enlightenment. They're both metaphors, of course. They're both interesting, aren't they? Waking up. Well, it's got a lot to be said for it. It's waking, it's the images of being asleep and, then being awake. It's a bit like the image of being drunk and being sober, or being ill and being well. So you've got that metaphor of wake up. And the image of enlightenment, however, seems to me to say even more than that, because it has a radiant effect. I heard recently that Bhante also prefers the metaphor of enlightenment because it's got an active aspect. Waking up is more passive in a sense, and also more separate and more secular, actually. The metaphor of waking up is taken from secular language. The metaphor of enlightenment is definitely religious. It can't not be. So I think it's interesting whether we think and talk in terms of waking up or enlightenment, and whether waking up leads us to think that the real spiritual life is something inner, as opposed to something that's lived among us. Anyway, you can argue that one in your discussion groups, and think about the metaphors you use. I think if we overprivilege this whole dimension of the cognitive insight dimension, we might tend to think of ethics in terms of the negative precept. We'll be more focused on cessation, so we might think in terms of ethics as following the negative precepts. We'll have come to a realization that there isn't a difference between self and other, so there won't be an inclination to harm. And I think that's not enough. We need to practice the positive precepts as well. In fact, Bhante has told us that the positive precepts are the real precepts, and I think it's because they've got this creative dimension, this limitless creative dimension. I think if we overprivilege the cognitive aspect, there's a danger that it's a danger in sort of over-schematicizing the teachings. We were talking about this on the college meeting. Subhuti was quoting Bhante as having said that there's often a trajectory that goes from inspiration to systemization and then to scholasticism. And we just need to be aware of that, especially if we're talking about models. I know there's a lot of excitement just now about the model of the 10 fetters. I must confess, I can never quite remember what they all are myself, but I know a lot of people are very excited by that model, and I'm sure it's very useful, but we have to be careful that we're not seduced by scholasticism, and then we try and fit our experience to a model artificially. So we have to keep in touch with the original inspiration. It can have a lot of weight, can't it, when something's scholasticized? It can give it an authority, but we need to make sure that that's not a sort of spurious authority, and we can do that by coming back to the inspiration. So that's a little, I've sort of told you why we need that, as I say, what happens without it, and also I warned against the overprivileging. In terms of ethics, if we don't have ethics, I've just written down one word, actually, and I thought that the word I've written down is horrible. So if we don't have ethics, we're in a horrible situation where I think, we just become sort of worse than ordinary people, I think, because our Dharma life just becomes this fantasy of pseudo-spiritualism. It becomes something, it becomes a private fantasy. It's not tested. However, if we overprivilege ethics at the expense of the other two, I think what we can do very easily is confuse secondary values with primary values. We can very easily get very interested in causes that we're very behind, whether it's veganism or ecology, deep ecology. I'm never quite sure what that meant, deep ecology, but inclusivity. We can get very taken by causes if we've overprivileged that at the expense of insight and this imaginative dimension. I think the best lecture, I think, to help us with this is Bhante's Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War. Obviously, it was given in a particular place with a particular issue, that of nuclear war. But everything he said, you could just slot in, veganism, ecology, inclusivity. You'd slot in any of these things into that. And what he says, paraphrasing, the whole first bit of the lecture, he's argued very, very strongly for how we must work to prevent nuclear war. He's really saying we've got to pull out all the stops to do that. But then he says something like, but if that's all we do, we'll have spectacularly failed. Because we're still, well, as Maitreyi said last night in her reading, we're still left with the existential issues. We're still left with the problem of death, as he puts it. We're still left with suffering. We'll have spectacularly failed if that's all we do. So it's do all you can, and know that that's not all there is to do. And also he argues if you come at it from the other way, if you solve the existential issues, you'll solve everything else as well. Yeah. So that could be possible homework to go and have a look at Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War, and just see how you can put everything else in there. So that's ethics. So without this whole with this, if you overprivilege this whole imaginative dimension, without right view or ethics, I think possibly the biggest danger is I've called it sort of religious delusion, where I have actually heard someone say this once, someone who was somebody preparing for ordination, and she was defending her still eating meat, and she said, Tara told me to do it. Now that's quite hard to argue with, isn't it? It gives it a sort of authority. So I think I would say, actually not knowing the person at all, to be honest, but but I think that's, without right view or ethics, it will be dangerous to overprivilege that. Without that dimension, however, I think we just set our sights too low, yeah? We kind of tend to think, oh, the Buddha's just me on a good day. It's too low. The trouble is, it's quite sneaky or something, because the trouble is there will be a measure of success. I was thinking of an example. See if this makes sense to you. It made quite a lot of sense to me. In my poetry class, I've got this very, very wonderful poetry teacher, and she was she's talking about different types of poetry, and she said basically some are easier to write than others. So there's this quite easy type of poem. It's called a collage poem. You can imagine it's just like a visual collage. You get different bits of interest and things and stick them together. She said, if in a class of 15 I asked everybody to do one of these collage poems, she said probably about 13 of them would be good enough to get published. Yeah, everybody would be able to do it, and actually they'd all be quite good and they'd all get published, or nearly all of them. She said, if I ask you all to do a villanelle is really hard to write well. You can write it badly fairly easily. Really hard to write well. Examples of a good one are Elizabeth Bishop's The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master. You wouldn't even know it was a villanelle because it's so beautifully done. Actually, it's a very, very, very difficult form. I haven't got time to tell you all the rules, but there's loads of them. So to do that well, she said, if I asked the whole class to do it, she said, only 2 people would be able to do it in their whole lives, you know. So do you see what I mean? If you've got an easy task, you will succeed at it and actually be successful even. And the poetry world get published in the world of our practice, I don't know, get insight or whatever. But if you've set your sights much higher, it'll be much harder to do. I wonder if this is why the Mahayana started talking in terms of these vast lengths of time. I wonder if what the Mahayana was trying to tell us is, don't set your sights too low. This is really hard, what we're trying to do. On one hand, you don't want to overemphasize the difficulty, or you just stay in bed. But, you know, you want to know that what you're trying to do is hard. I got a tiny glimpse of this on my solitary retreat. Towards the end of this whole 5 months on retreat, I started every night, I've told a few of you this already, just started to feel this terror of death, basically. And I realised it just felt so deep, and it felt so raw, you know. I just, there was actually a kind of strange pleasure in the rawness. I felt I'd got to some truth in myself, and the truth in myself was, basically, I don't care who dies as long as it's not me. Yeah, I don't care. All meta niceness, all you like. Actually, the bottom line, I don't care who dies as long as it's not me. And that just felt true, and it felt deeper than personal. It felt like nothing to do with a sort of personal wish to live or die. It actually felt like nothing to do with me. It felt like just something deeply, felt like life itself, the desire of life itself to live. And when I think of a phrase like turning around in the deepest sea of consciousness, I think, that's what we're trying to turn around. We're trying to make that will to enlightenment, that bodhicitta, stronger than that. And honestly, I felt like this was just a tiny taste of it, but I started to get a sense of, the task is enormous. So without that sort of view that includes that, we set our sights too low. We'll settle for something too less. Also, without experience of something beyond, all experience, all our experience becomes too self-referential. Now, what I want to say is we can't help that. We're not to be blamed for that. We mustn't think that we're kind of horrible, selfish creatures for that tendency. That just is the way. That just is the way we are. That's why we're here. It's because of that in the first place why we're here. So we can't actually help it. So we mustn't. It's not bad that that tendency to self-referentialness isn't bad. It's just how we're hardwired, and without doing something consciously to undo that, we just revert back to that all the time. And I think the only way I can see to get beyond that is to have an experience of something that's completely outside that, that's drawing us on, as it were. So that is a little like whistle-stop tour of these three areas. What happens without them, but also what happens if you overprivilege each one. But what I want to say, although I've sort of argued for each of them, I think that third area is the most important. I don't think it's a level playing field between all the three for discussion in your groups. I think this third aspect of the need for something that's beyond all experience is the most important. The ethics is only important in the context of something far larger. The insight is only important in the context of something far larger. On the ordination retreat I was on, we were studying the three jewels, and I got terribly excited when I was looking at the section. Bhante calls it the goal and the three jewels. It's on enlightenment. I tell you what, I hadn't realised, to my embarrassment, that the three jewels was originally written to be part of an encyclopedia. And that helped me to understand and see something. I saw Bhante's encyclopedic knowledge. I saw that when he's going through the goal section, he's very carefully describing it in all these different ways. That's because it's for an encyclopedia. So he's saying, okay, you can look at it in the negative, you can look at it in the positive, you can look at it in the paradox, or you can look at it in the, what's the other one, the imaginary, the sort of image one. So he's going through all this, and it's, I was saying this on the ordination tree, it's like, encyclopedia. So, but then every now and then something just bursts through that's nothing like an encyclopedia. Something just bursts through, Bhante. You can't quite do the encyclopedia thing anymore. And I started to get interested in where does he sort of go far beyond of talking like an encyclopedia. And it's in a few places. It's mainly when he's talking about that you can't think of the qualities of enlightenment represented by these three areas. You can't think of perfect wisdom, of perfect compassion, of the perfect freedom he talks about in terms of the volitional aspect. You can't think of them in the abstract. You have to think of them as united. That's an important thing as well. They're not separate anymore. He calls it an absolute person. These days he'd talk about the suprapersonal force, wouldn't he? Something that's personal. That's the important thing for him. He said, because you need a person, you need not a person, it's suprapersonal. But you can't love an idea, he's saying. You can't adore an idea. You need to be able to adore. You need to be able to love. And he calls it the absolute person. He means the absolute Buddha. Now we would say the suprapersonal, which is not subpersonal. It's personal, but beyond what we ordinarily think of as a person. That's where Bhante kind of takes flight in that chapter, and that can be seen only with the eye of the imagination. So I think this is the most important of everything. I think this is the most important of everything I've said so far, that we need to connect with something far larger and beyond us. This, of course, is symbolised for us by the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, who are, if you like, condensations of that absolute bodhicitta. You've got the jewel at the heart of Avalokiteshvara is the condensation. And all practice and all insight even is only important in relation to that. All our sadhanas are about this, about bodhicitta. But then, this is now me moving on to the last bit of the talk, the order itself is a bodhisattva, according to Bhante. The order itself is Avalokiteshvara. The order itself is a condensation of bodhicitta. So what does this mean? So I think to understand what this means, we have to understand what our order means. We have to understand what our ordination means, particularly the public aspect of our, what we call the public ordination. That we need to understand that. And I think our order lives are lived trying to understand that. So if the order is merely an association of individuals who've committed with Buddhism, who are all finding their own way. In other words, if you only had the private aspect of ordination, if you never had the public ordination, I think the order cannot be this condensation of the absolute bodhicitta. If the order is a community with a common vision, I think you get a bit closer to it, but it all just still sounds a bit sort of too secular for me, a bit prosaic to even say they like a community with a common vision. Blah, blah, blah. Sounds good, but, it's not, doesn't particularly excite me, just that. It's getting closer. If, on the other hand, for me, and I think it's not just for me, I think this is for all of us, since I've got the platform, I will say that. I think the order, to be the bodhicitta, we have to relate to the order as a mysterious living body. Yeah, I really loved it when Subhuti and Maitreyi Nagarjuna started to coin this term Sangakaya. It completely made sense of my own experience of the order. Because my own experience was particularly of gatherings of the order, say like order weekends and conventions and so on. I'd always leave them, and I always do leave them, feeling uplifted and inspired. But when I look back on it, I can never pinpoint what it was. As a matter of fact, if I try and do that, it doesn't really work for me because I've got quite a critical mind. So I'm always going, talks weren't actually very good. The groups were a bit, I can't actually, there's nothing that adds up to the inspiration I feel. So this term Sangakaya really made sense to me, the mystery of that. And I think that's how we have to relate to the order. It's very mysterious. It's kind of inconvenient as well, and difficult. I was sitting in meditation this morning. I was kind of trying to do the Metta Bhavana. I was doing the Metta Bhavana. I was a little sort of keyed up because of the talk I was about to give. And I noticed then when I was in the Metta Bhavana thinking of all of you, I had you sort of roughly divided into two camps, which was people I thought would like what I was going to say and people who wouldn't like it. And and it's so tempting at those moments to think, I wish the order consisted of just the people who would like it, Then that'd be great, wouldn't it? And then I thought, no, Subhadramati, this is it, this is it. It's the whole order that is it. This is the arena. These words are all too prosaic, but this is it, this is what it means. This is something we've got to go. We can't just if we just did everything, basically if we just did everything that we liked, everybody thinks the exact same as me, it's just, actually, it wouldn't satisfy me. It's too personalistic. We're trying to do something much, much grander, much more difficult to understand, especially in this individualist culture. And so I think that's the way we need. This term Sangakaya, I think, is very, very good. I want to finish. I've sort of hope you'll indulge me with going a little bit over time because I want to say something about Bhante and the order. And what I want to say is probably not necessary to say, but that Bhante is indispensable to our order. Bhante is indispensable. And the image kept coming into my mind of the moonlight and the moon. you can't take away the moon. It's like we love the moonlight, and it's a bit like we kind of love if we try and take Bhante away from the order, if we were even to want to do that, it'd be a bit like as we love the moonlight, but we get a bit closer to the moon and we think, it's just this lump of rock, all craters and everything. Let's get rid of the moon. But then you've got no moonlight. Like we can't have the moonlight without the moon. I'm interested that Bhante talking about his own sadhana practices, all his sadhana practices, when he practices them, they're inseparable from the particular teacher that gave him that practice. I was very, very struck by that. He said it's not even the thought of the teacher, but it's all a whole piece. But how do we think of Bhante? So it's hard, isn't it? Because we're trying to do a very difficult thing, because we've got Bhante is our teacher, and Bhante is a human being, and they can feel like different things. Sometimes I was thinking we can take from we're talking about this on a recent council retreat at the LBC, that maybe we can take for our guide the way Bhante talks about the Buddha and human enlightenment, that lecture. He says the mysterious thing isn't the human and it isn't the enlightened being, it's human enlightenment. If you just think of the Buddha, in this example, as just human, then you've reduced the Buddha. If you just think of enlightenment, you've kind of rarefied something. It becomes a bit like, I don't know, the way we were taught to think of the Pope and the Catholic Church. If you don't include the human at all, we're trying to, with the Buddha and with Bhante, trying to have both. I think a way we can think of it is, yes, we have to bring our critical mind to how we relate to Bhante. We have to bring our questions, but they have to be within love and devotion. Then it's all right. Then everything's all right if it's within love and devotion. If it's the other way around, then it's not all right. Then it goes wrong. If the love and devotion is just a smaller element in the criticism, we've got to have it the other way around. We've got to have any criticism or questioning within this larger context of love and devotion. Then it's all right. Then the flow of Adhisthana can still flow. Otherwise, we'll block the flow of Adhisthana. So we have to think for ourselves and collectively about this. Of course, I'm very well aware, as we all are, one can't ignore questions and one can't force love and devotion. But one can have an intention for that to flourish. Well, one can have intention for one or other to flourish, in actual fact. What we reflect on will grow. I must say, one thing I've been doing here, especially here on this Order Weekend, is just reflecting on how much Bhante loves us. That's a very strong effect, actually, on me, just to think, well, because it's quite amazing, actually, after everything, in a way, that Bhante, I'm sure, is aware of us on this Order Weekend. He loves us. And I was thinking that somehow collectively, it's like the question for me is, how do we do both? How do we make sure that we give space? For example, in the forum we had yesterday, we gave space, and in other forums for the questioning and so on to be given voice to. We definitely want to make sure of that. But also, we want to make sure we give space for the love and devotion to be able to be expressed as well, and not create a culture that inhibits that. Just as we don't want to create a culture that inhibits the questioning, we don't want to create a culture that inhibits the love and devotion, which can also happen. Can also happen. It's hard to rise above the culture. We would tend to do what those around us are supporting. So, yeah, I think that's important for us to think about. Well, that moment in a talk where I want to say more, but we're at time. Let me just think how I want to finish. Well, maybe I'll just finish by talking just finish talking about Bhante, his place in our order and our order. So Bhante's vision is the Buddha's vision, I believe. But Bhante can't put that vision into being on his own. Even the Buddha couldn't put that vision into being on his own, because actually no one can, not even a Buddha. So it's interesting that the first thing that the Buddha did after enlightenment was he created an order. Bhante's created an order. In a sense that, that is actually what the world needs. The world doesn't need remarkable individuals. The world needs an order, an Arya Sangha, really. That would be the best of all. And Bhante has entrusted us with that now. He might not have given us everything we want or even that we think we need, but personally I'm sure of this, that he's given us all he can. As a matter of fact, I'd say he's given us far more than he can, in a sense. So if the bodhicitta is going to continue living as a force in the world, then we need to work in these three ways that I've outlined. So we need to deeply inquire into the conditioned so that we go through the door into the unconditioned. We need to make the conditioned more and more susceptible to the unconditioned. And most of all, we need to do that in the context of something far bigger. And we need to do that in the context of the whole order and with Bhante as our guide and beloved teacher.